All right, well, I think as regular attendees of the Energy Center events know, we like to promptly start on time and end on time. Thanks to those of you joining in person here in Morningside Heights in New York. Thanks to the many people I know watching online right now as well. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor here at the School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and it's really a treat to have our guests from all over the world with us today to talk about this incredibly interesting, timely, and important topic in how the global gas market is changing. Energy markets in general, as we all know, are in significant transition right now. A historic oil price collapse, renewable costs falling, 195 nations coming together in Paris to promise to completely change the energy system as we know it. And the global gas market is also lacks no shortage of really fundamental transformational change, I think, right now. They're going to talk about this, but we've seen the global gas market go from a business of point-to-point pipelines where a supplier serves a few demand centers to one with massive expansion in global capacity for LNG, which is going to have significant impacts on pricing, on energy trade, on geopolitical relationships between countries, sources of supply and demand shifting. Roughly a 50% increase through the end of the decade in global LNG supply, lion's share, nearly all of it from the US and Australia. So the US also has a very important role to play in this. And just to give some sense of how the energy outlook has changed in a short period of time, I think it was the 2005 annual energy outlook, which projected that this year, the US would be importing a volume of natural gas roughly twice what Qatar puts in the global market. And we just exported our first shipment of LNG from Sabine Pass. We've had about 25, roughly, something like that. Cargoes go to mostly Latin America, but also to Europe, to Asia, and even some to the Middle East. So the US is exporting energy to the Middle East. For its substitutability, gas is not only about electricity, it's about buildings, it's about industry, increasingly potentially about transport. We'll see what our guests have to say. Lower air pollution, if methane is controlled, lower carbon than coal. But increasingly, this question about the golden age of gas that the IEA and others wrote about 5 years ago, maybe questions about exactly whether we're going to see that play out because of the way policy is designed, which if you set a low price on carbon and support other fuels can squeeze gas, or policy can help it. New technologies, whether it's in transport or distributed generation, will have impacts in both directions on gas. So lots of questions about what the demand side, demand outlook is going to be. Revolutions obviously on the supply side, shale being just one of those, but lots of massive new offshore gas supplies as well. And all of that is going to mean significant change and transition in the global LNG market. So this book is really, that's why at the Energy Center we're spending increasing amounts of time studying the global gas market with recent additions we've made to our team, like most recently Tim Bursma, who joined us from the Brookings Institution. And it's really, this is a very, take the time to read as much as you can, if not all of this book. It is very timely, it's very interesting, and it's really an impressive piece of work. And I appreciate Anne-Sophie and David taking the time to be with us here today and to talk about it. I want to acknowledge also Howard Rogers and Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. So with Oxford and KAPSARC here in the room, and David Hobbs, the head of research at KAPSARC, you have some of the best leading energy research institutes in the world who've come with us to release their new book. Anne-Sophie Corbeau has been working in the energy industry for 15 years, focusing on gas. Joined KAPSARC 2 years ago and co-edited this book. Before that, she worked for 5 years as the top gas analyst at the International Energy Agency in Paris, and before that was at CERA, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, now known by another name. And David Ledesma is a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, also an independent energy and strategy consultant who focuses on LNG and natural gas, has spent more than 3 decades in the energy and utility sector in Shell and other companies, worked on the development of lots of complex integrated energy projects and negotiated at the government level, has written many, many books about the global gas market in different regions, Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and also about gas project financing and the pricing of gas in the global market. So we have a lot of expertise in the gas market who've helped put this really extraordinary book together, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have today about it. And before I turn it over to them, they'll present for about between 30 and 40 minutes summarizing the book, and then I'll pose some questions and we'll have a conversation about it. And before that, let me see if David Hobbs wants to just say a word to welcome everyone. I was told you did, but you don't have to.
I did. And I was told that I had to whether I wanted to or not. So unaccustomed as I am to unexpectedly speaking, this book is really a collaboration. It's more than that. It's a labour of love by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and KAPSARC. We're here being hosted by one of the brightest, most exciting new energy policy research centres, and something to which KAPSARC will aspire to achieve as quickly the reputation that Jason and his institution has created. The Oxford Institute has obviously been around for rather longer and is a better known brand, and so as the new guys we were delighted to be asked, but it truly has been a partnership, and David and Anne-Sophie have really driven it. There's one sentence that whenever I hear it, it makes me bridle, which is, it's pretty safe to say that. And the global LNG business is a business about which an awful lot of people with an awful lot of grey hair, to the extent they still have any hair to be grey, will say, it's pretty safe to say that. And then they end that sentence with whatever their view of the global gas market is. This book was in part an attempt to demonstrate that it's not pretty safe to say anything about the global gas business. The second sentence that describes it is, it's great when a clan comes together this way. 2 years ago, one might have had a view about what the global gas market was going to look like, but during the course of the research, actually nearly 3 years, I suppose, is it, Jonathan? The market has changed enough that the book has become relevant in a way that it might not otherwise have done. And so I just want to thank all the various people, the support that KAPSARC was able to give, the support that the Institute was able to give, the 12 or 13 authors who were pulled together, corralled by David and Sophie, all the other people who worked hard and maybe didn't get as much recognition in making sure it happened. And I'm going to tell you, it's a page turner that will surprise you even to the final page. So don't give up halfway through, because you will miss the punchline along the way. But if these guys do their job, they won't give away the punchline either, and force you to read one of the copies we're delighted to have given you. So with that, as I say, thank you, Jason, for hosting us here today. Thank you all for turning up to listen to the thesis of this, and over to you guys.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My own thanks to Jason and the team for hosting us here today. My name's David Ledesma, and I'm taking the first round of presentation on the book, and I'm going to hand over to Anne-Sophie. As has been mentioned, we're probably going to talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion. Starting with the Mugs Gallery, there are 13 authors. 4 of us are here today, myself, Anne-Sophie, Jonathan Stern, and Howard Rogers, who will join in the panel. I think some of the other faces you'll recognize up there as pretty well being experts in the business. But moving on quickly to why now? I think that's the first thing, and it was alluded to in the introductory discussions. We started this in mid-2014, and at that time there was only 100 million tons under construction. Asia was a bottomless premium pit for LNG. Oil prices were at the heady $100, and literally, when was the next FID going to take place? That was the mentality at the time, and I remember having discussions right at the beginning of the book on that basis. And the question is, how long is the business going to be affected by these changes? That was the kind of discussions we were having. We're now sitting here when in September 2016 we closed the book, Authoring Wise, in May 2016, which includes all the 2015 data. So it's got data right up to 2015, so it's completely up to date. 150 million tons has come on. Asian buyer demand growth is uncertain, and there are contractual flexibility requirements. Sellers are looking for markets, and you could see the big question is what FID, when, and by who. And I think that it's, we're also, as we sit here, awaiting the first FLNG startup, first floating liquefaction startup, a new technology which has been brought about for one reason, and now is taking another reason, potentially to be a lower cost source of new liquefaction capacity in this particularly difficult market. The other thing is we have new players. This business is not like it was. Cheniere has driven huge change. Why do you do it that way? And the message I always give to when I stand up at conferences and talk to rooms full of people who are the existing players is, you better change. Because if you don't change, then life's going to get very tough, because it is substantially difficult. And also, there's huge confusion over contractual flexibility and particular pricing. And I use the word confusion as an important word there to explain it. So I think that brought us round then to why we're doing the book. And it really comes down, are we going to a complete reconfiguration or restructuring of the business? And before I show the next slide, I would like to point out it is Anne-Sophie's picture. We show it, I think she put it in the presentation just to embarrass the presenters, but it's rather sweet little pussycats. But anyway, I think the message we're really saying is there was a cosy club, and that is now changing. Change is happening. And I think another metaphor is it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable, the change for the existing players, and I always like to say new players, new models. And we are in a transition. These are the kind of words and expressions that have come out as we have authored this book. There are new diversified players across the whole value chain, and answering and challenging why do it like that? We're going to do it in a different way. And I cannot just say, I think this process is not just stopped as today, it's going to carry on. And we'll talk about that more later on. Aggregators are increasing their roles, buyers are going upstream, traders are participating, new entrants are coming into the market, even in Asia. And we put that on purpose. Just hearing in the last 24 hours, JERA has announced that it's done its actual first reload, and they're actually trading now, which is their intention for their business, and they're driving the change in that particular part of the world. And we're starting to see alliances, and alliances I mentioned on the buyer side, often being forced by financial reasons, but it's there and it's actually happening. So changing market structures are driving new LNG contract structures and pricing models. I authored the structures chapter in the book. The conclusion of those structures is they will adapt. We will find a structure that works. Now, people look at the Cheniere tolling model and they say, oh, it's so modern. Well, no, that was actually done for Indonesia right at the inception of the LNG business, but it's been adapted. It's been adapted. And so project structures will adapt, I believe, as the LNG business changes. So where is LNG demand heading? Well, in the book, we've come up with 4 cases, and there's a table at the back of the book. I can't remember the page number, but it's in the conclusions at the back. And there's a considerable range between the high and the low estimates, which in 2020 are about 80 million tonnes, and by 2030, 165 million tonnes. There's a third difference, 33% difference between the high and the low. And that is because there are so many uncertainties, which we'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. Predominantly, it's obviously Asia, which I'll discuss in the next slide, but Europe very much, and we were talking earlier on to some of you before the presentation was made, is going to play that balancing role, absorbing unwanted volumes and facing in a low demand world. The question is how much can that be absorbed, and that is going to be a function also of the reaction of Gazprom and also other pipeline suppliers, Norway and North Africa, into Europe. Europe is not a bottomless pit, so we mustn't actually fall to the assumption we had when we started writing the book. And it's going to get, I think, quite challenging and quite interesting there, and I'm sure that's something we'll be picking up in the discussion later on. There is potential upside in the transport sector. Very small volumes. I think that the news that we should be hearing from the IMO relatively shortly about hopefully a 2020 advancement of the ECA areas will mean there's going to be some extra underpinning for demand, which will be good. So we have a wide-ranging 4 cases of regional demand, focusing on Asia, I think as the fundamental basis. In 2015, about 73% of LNG demand was Asia, and we estimate that will reduce slightly to about 65%, 64% by 2030. But you could see between the low and the high cases and the valiant work which Howard did authoring the chapter, doing a bottom-up calculation of demand in all the Asian countries, there's considerable variation due to distinct factors, and I'll come to that in the next couple of slides. But it's going to remain the largest importing region very clearly, but I think there are huge changes taking place. For years and years, people talked about deregulation, liberalization in Japan and gone, yeah, that won't happen, yeah. It's happening. It is happening, and it's going to be forced through, and there are other factors that are driving it to make sure that that is going to happen. Policies on nuclear, what is the role of coal, what is the role of renewables, and how are domestic prices going to be able to support the development of new liquefaction capacity? What models are going to create new capacity? Because there's going to have to be, otherwise we're going to be heading for some very difficult times in the mid-2020s, I believe. And so they're the fundamental challenges facing our business today. People forget we're in a surplus area, everything's okay. Actually, within the next 3 years, we've got to take some tough decisions. Only one FID this year. I think we could potentially see 1, maybe 2 others this year if we're lucky. So talking about the mature Asian markets, I briefly mentioned Japan, uncertainty, it's a pace of nuclear, energy efficiency policy, and also the liberalization process there. And I'm not going to go through the top right-hand picture, but you can just see with all those lines coming out, it shows the different models and different scenarios that have been pulled together depending on the level of nuclear cases and demand and also the contractual position of the market. South Korea, future LNG demand is very much muted at the moment by limiting government policy limiting the power sector, hoping to offset coal by renewables and nuclear. We have to see how that one's going to pan out. Also, are we going to see liberalization in that market, something that the unions certainly have resisted in the past. Taiwan, though a far smaller market, and of course each of these graphs are on different scales because of the size of the market. Very clearly there, the nuclear policy is to phase out nuclear, and power demand growth is hugely uncertain as well in that market. So the Asian markets, large uncertainty, I would say limited upside. China, of course, huge amount of uncertainty there, but there's a greater upside potential in these markets. There's certainly demand growth is subject to policy, coal and gas, power generation, greater efficiency, how's the space heating going to work its way through, and also on the supply side, what is going to happen on shale? It hasn't had huge successes to date, but I think there's been a reinvigoration now of that, and we could find the role of shale increasing, together with what is the role of pipelines going to be. Are we really going to find China is going to become that hub, that price hub, which we've been talking about? And Anne-Sophie will cover that in her part of the presentation. The Russian pipeline projects and the uncertainty there, I think, are quite a critical factor, and therefore the ranges lie substantially between about 75 and 105 BCM, which is considerable variation that exists on the upside, the high side, and the low side. Moving, I mentioned briefly, but moving to Europe, we see it as the swing market simply because it's a totally flexible market that can absorb the LNG, but as I said earlier on, it's not a bottomless pit, and it's facing uncertainties not only in the role of gas itself and the role of renewables and the pricing of coal and undermining. It seems, I always think it's strange making these presentations. We talk about renewables on one side being a very clean fuel, but we see coal as the competition on the other. Absolutely the opposites, but they are the great competition. Of course, gas lies in the middle. In the way I see it. But it's declining production of indigenous production, and we do see that gas will have some role. But despite that, Europe is going to have to increase its gas imports, but the question is from where? And Russia is clearly stating they're actually going to not reduce their market share, and they will become a competitor for LNG. It was interesting to see how that falls out, what the prices are, how much will be absorbed. But I think the general view amongst the industry is, the US LNG, when it starts to be picking up in 2018, 2019, is not going to be operating at full capacity until we see some of the demand growing elsewhere in the world. So we're going to find some of those facilities being paid for but not used. And I just wonder how long that business model will continue for and what the impact of that is going to be. And there are different scenarios. Perhaps we can talk about that, Jason, when we come to that discussion. Talking about Latin America, really energy demand, particularly power demand, is growing. Development of local resources is certainly taking more time. But I think we are starting to see that there's going to be greater growth of domestic production. The Institute, the OAS, is currently preparing a paper on Argentinian domestic shale production. I think it's going to be interesting to see. Some of the conclusions there are perhaps there is more optimism on the upside there, but that's something we can discuss separately. And we're also finding that gas is very much a complementary source of firm energy when you're operating it against hydro and intermittent renewables. And that's been causing part of the problem which Brazil and Argentina have had in purchasing LNG, because they haven't known what the demand's going to be. When they go out, of course, they have to pay a premium price. But they've had to change their buying policies to achieve that. And certainly, we still see by 2030 the region's going to need LNG. But just looking at the bottom line, a huge range again of uncertainty that's going to exist and the variation on that. So just a couple more slides from me before I hand over to Anne-Sophie, just to carry on going around the world, talking about the Middle East and Africa. Certainly this is not just a niche market, but we have demand estimates by 2030 of a low about 20 million tonnes, but a high of 50 million tonnes, so a very wide range. And that is fundamentally due to many countries facing gas shortages, needing power generation, and new countries looking to import LNG. And we just see the way Egypt has moved from being an exporter to an importer. Oman is operating its liquefaction capacity well below 100%. And you're signing imports as well into the UAE. So we're finding also that with the low prices, it's difficult to attract LNG and difficult to underpin it, but it's a region where growth will have to come through. And Africa, I think, is seen as a huge hope, but it takes a huge amount of time to build up demand there. Lack of infrastructure, low prices again, cause a lot of issues. And Sophie's working on an excellent paper at the moment on Africa, and so I urge, when that's published, to read it. It's absolutely excellent. But there are a lot of countries looking for LNG, but they've got all the challenges they're going to face that. And most of them, of course, are opting for floating storage of regas units, which gives quick access to the market. But it's not the complete solution, because you could have an FSRU on site in about 12 months, but you've got to have something to attach it to, and then you've got to have a gas pipeline, you've got to have a market, you've got to have somebody who's going to be able to underpin that in a credit basis and a price basis. And the issue of financing and regulatory uncertainty for prospective sellers, not to mention payment issues, is a huge challenge. So it's a huge market, but all these challenges mean there's a huge wide range between the high and the low. And I think the key message I'd like to give you there is, number one, operators need to value that demand, and then it'll be developed. So for my last slide is to talk about the prospects for LNG and use and transport. As the oil price goes back down again, the challenges for switching are coming up again. So low prices certainly make the financial case harder to move from a liquids fuel to LNG. Legislation has to drive it, as we've seen in Europe. And technical advances are required. The challenge we've had in Europe is having a truck that has enough power to be able to operate efficiently on the roads. Iveco has just launched one, and actually in the last week has delivered their first trucking unit, which is announced as being successful. Initial prospects are that there'll be stronger growth in marine simply due to size. One ferry is about 1,300 buses. And I think that's quite an interesting fact when we start talking about that. And certainly it's easier to establish refueling facilities, and we've seen that Norway has demonstrated what is possible. It could be a significant market by 2030. And for those of you who've got the book, on page 462, you'll find a wide-ranging demand estimate for LNG and road transport. I think growth can be rapid, and I think it will be rapid, but it'll only happen if people at the top have the mentality to actually want to implement LNG for environmental as well as economic reasons. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to my fellow editor, Anne-Sophie, who's going to run the rest of the presentation. There we go.
Thank you very much. So as David highlighted, we have some uncertainty on the future of LNG demand. And the next question is, of course, where is new supply going to come from? What we know right now is that we have about 150 MTPA, which is arriving to the market between 2015 and 2020. Most of that is actually coming from the United States and Australia. It's also important to remember that LNG supply from a lot of existing LNG suppliers, such as Oman, Abu Dhabi, Trinidad and Tobago, Indonesia, is actually declining. But then, who is going to provide the next LNG supply post-2020? Well, we have actually about 1,000 MTPA of planned LNG projects across the world. A lot of them are located in North America, also Australia, Russia, Eastern Africa, but we don't know yet who is going to take FID. So far, during 2016, only one project, one brownfield project, Tango LNG, has taken FID. There might be the opportunity to have one or two more projects taking FID, but this is extremely challenging. First, as David highlighted, we have a lot of uncertainties on demand and prices, oil prices and gas prices across the world are very low. What we understand is that cost is going to be king. No more Gorgon LNG at $54 billion. This is way too expensive. Right now, you need to focus on small and very cost-competitive projects. So there will be a lot of opportunities for brownfield expansion in politically stable countries. Countries which are going to be difficult, new LNG exporting countries also are going to be challenging, but those which have a difficult fiscal or regulatory framework might actually be left behind. If we look at the different key future LNG suppliers, obviously Australia stands out. I mean, it's going to be the largest LNG exporter hopefully by 2019, with currently 7 LNG projects which are under construction or came recently. We still have 3 more to go. But this LNG is really not arriving in the best conditions. I mean, when people took FID, oil prices were at $100. Probably project sponsors were expecting something like $14 per MMBTU, but the prices are more towards $7 to $8 per MMBTU. So for the projects which were expensive, I mean, the costs have really to come down. And when we are looking at Australia, yes, there are a lot of possibilities for expansion, notably brownfield expansion, but this is a very challenging environment. When conditions are better and improving, there is still the possibility to have about 20 MTPA coming from Australia, but this is really longer term. Obviously, a region in which everybody here is very interested in, this is North America, which has only about 600 plus MTPA of planned LNG projects. I mean, let's face it, not everybody is going to come online. Only a few projects are actually going to move ahead. And the conditions are completely different, both for the United States and Canada. I mean, when the US LNG projects took FID, the conditions were markedly different. They were mostly driven by this great appetite coming from Asia, that everybody thought it would be bottomless, and on top of that, by the great price differential between US Henry Hub gas prices and Asian prices. These conditions are no longer prevailing. So which project will take FID? Probably some brownfield expansions stand better chances, but that's only for the United States. In Canada, well, they definitely missed a window of opportunity during the 2013-2014 period, and these projects are greenfield projects. They require a lot of infrastructure, and they are also facing local opposition. So actually, you can really wonder whether we will see a single projects coming from Canada. Turning to Russia, then, I mean, there's a project, the outlook is kind of different. There is a project which is currently under construction, Yamal LNG, which will be operational hopefully by 2020. But when you look at the next generation of Russian LNG projects, the main issue that we are facing is obviously the sanctions, along with some relatively high costs for some projects. But there are a couple of projects which are a no-brainer. I mean, Sakhalin 2, for example, the third train of the Sakhalin 2 LNG projects, I mean, has actually good chances if it were not for the sanctions. Baltic LNG also could have good chances, but it's facing some issues with the cost and also, I mean, the prospects in terms of natural gas demand in the region. Kaliningrad and Baltic bunker market is actually also quite limited. A region on which we have been working a lot in KAPSARC is Eastern Africa, which is Mozambique and Tanzania. Again, I mean, like North America is crucial to really make the distinction between Mozambique, which is clearly ahead, and maybe we will have an FID of any floating LNG this year or maybe next year. But Tanzania is really, really behind. And I mean, when I last visited Tanzania, actually, I was told FID 2020. So, I mean, given the current market conditions, given where the country is currently in terms of developing all the regulatory framework, there is actually a slight chance that Tanzania LNG may not actually be a reality at all. But for Mozambique, I mean, we could almost move to up to more than 30 MTPA of LNG in the longer term. FLNG, I mean, this is also something which could have real chances. The first floating LNG is likely to start operate this year. I mean, this is not actually Prelude, Shell's Prelude project in Australia. This is the Canoid project in Malaysia. It has already arrived on site and is expected to start this year. But we have already quite a few projects which are under construction. And there are more which are under studies. The difficulty in floating LNG is that right now we don't have any feedback on how well it's going to operate and how much it's going to cost. And there are actually, I mean, not all the FLNG projects are the same. You have to make a distinction between the Shell's Prelude project, which is really designed for this specific field, and the different approach from companies like Golar, which are offering a more standardized approach. And the key question for floating LNG is whether they could actually achieve the cost reduction which is really needed right now on the supply side for LNG in order to make sure that LNG post-2020 will have a chance. So based on that, I mean, the supply and demand balance that we have, been talking about, I mean, the key question is really, when are markets going to be balanced? Again, only one FID this year after all the FIDs that have been taken over the past 5 years. This is relatively few. We have really a pause right now in terms of LNG supply, which is going to translate into the period post-2020. But as we know, I mean, demand and supply are moving in cycles. So there is a potential for LNG demand to pick up again, driven by the low gas prices, while actually we will be facing a shortage of LNG supply post-2020. But there are a lot of projects which are at the planning stage. So are some companies going to still take FID, maybe based on contracts, portfolio contracts, despite the very difficult condition, despite all the uncertainty on demand, and also the very low oil and gas prices? And also, the fact that we have a lot of LNG supply coming to the market may create some unexpected consequences. I mean, as David mentioned, a lot of the LNG is arriving to the market over 2017, 2019. This is where most of the US LNG projects are going to start, and we will have already all the Australian LNG on the market. If demand in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa is not enough to absorb all this incremental LNG supply, then there will be a lot of unwanted or surplus LNG looking for a home. And the ideal home here is actually Europe, because Europe has a lot of underutilized regasification capacity, as liquid trading hubs. So naturally, you know, this LNG is going to be heading towards Europe. But in Europe, as David mentioned, we have not only uncertainties about future demand and the decline in domestic production, but we have also one major supplier, which is Russia. And Russia, whose main market up to 2020 and maybe a little bit longer is and remains Europe, is not going to be particularly happy to have all this LNG invading its main markets. So the key question is really, are we going to have a price war in Europe whereby Gazprom and Russia will actually change their usual pricing strategy and their usual way of responding to market changes? Right now, and up until now, they have been really responding to changes, but are they going to take a proactive stance and really change their market behavior in order to keep this LNG at bay? What we have also observed on the global LNG market is a rise in flexibility. And this is really a key change on global LNG market. What we call the rise of spot and short-term, which means the contracts below 4 years LNG trade. As you can see on the graphic, it has been increasing up to 28% of global LNG trade by 2015. And this has been driven by changes both on the supply side and the demand side. Supply side, for example, some uncommitted LNG in some specific projects. Ramp-up volumes, so some LNG cargoes which are actually without contracts when the LNG plant is starting, or volumes which have been redirected, or portfolio LNG. But also on the demand side, there have been a lot of demand shocks. There has been also the liberalization in Europe and the removal of final destination clauses, and also a change in the nature of buyers. We no longer have the state-owned utilities which are quite confident about the future growth of their market. Now, utilities in Europe in particular, they have to fight against each other, and they have also to be competitive against other commodities. So these kind of changes that we have seen evolving over the past decade, well, they are going to continue. And actually, this is what I call the buyer's dilemma. When you are a buyer right now, you don't know at all what your demand is going to be over the next 20 years. You don't know what the demand will be at a country level, because what's going to be the future economic growth? We have seen how China's economy has been slowing down over the past 2 years. How competitive is natural gas going to be against coal? What will be the future development of renewable? What will be the policy on nuclear in selected countries, in particular in Japan? So this is creating a lot of uncertainties for natural gas demand at a country level. But we also have liberalization processes in key countries such as Japan and China. So that means that for a company, they have also to be competitive against the next company nearby. And they don't know what their future demand is going to be, and also they will have more difficulty to pass through their LNG costs towards the end users. So in these conditions, how can you commit for 20 years? That's a key question. So we anticipate that actually there will be a very dramatic increase of spot and short-term LNG over the next few years, which will be driven by this uncommitted LNG, but also by portfolio LNG, the rise in US flexible LNG, and also crucially by the lack of extension or lower extension of expiring contracts. Now, for example, if you are Qatar and Korea, which are two countries where we have a lot of expiring contracts over the next 10 years, do you really want to extend your contract for another 10 or 20 years? No. First of all, you are already over-contracted, so you don't know what to do with your current LNG. And you don't know what your future demand is going to be, as David showed. So you are going to say to your favorite seller, well, I'm very sorry, but unless you are really changing completely the contract terms, I think I may not extend my contract, or maybe I'm going to extend it for another 2-3 years, in which case we are in a short-term LNG contract. So this is something that people have to keep in mind. Right now we are in a buyer's market, but the buyers are not particularly inclined to extend the existing long-term contracts for a long period. And also there is flexibility which is going to increase from another part of the LNG value chain, which is shipping. We have been doing a little bit of optimization and computing, and we understand that right now it doesn't make any sense for US LNG to go to Singapore while Qatari LNG goes to Europe. It will make more sense for US LNG to go to Europe and Qatari LNG to go to Asia. So if you do an optimization on a global level, we calculate that actually you could gain about $2 billion per year. Doesn't seem much. Actually, it comes down to about $0.1 per MMBTU. But please remember, I mean, margins right now are very low. And we can see that there is more and more questions and initiatives about cooperation between either groups of buyers or buyers and sellers. So this is definitely something that companies are starting to think about. Now, I have been saying that, yes, buyers are reluctant to commit for long-term contracts or to extend their long-term contracts. So what are the implications? Well, for the existing long-term contracts, for facilities which in principle have been already amortized, there will be definitely less appetite to extend these existing long-term contracts. And specifically, if sellers are saying, yes, I mean, we are going to continue on the traditional oil indexation, then buyers may say, well, thank you very much, but I can actually get as much spot LNG as I want for a lower price. Now, what about new facilities which would need, actually, according to traditional wisdom, which will need long-term contracts? Right now, it's still quite early to say new facilities are going to move ahead without long-term contracts. For that to happen, you will need a lot of conditions, including spot LNG trade to become the norm, but also to have reliable price benchmarks, to have also a substantial drop in the cost of the LNG facilities, no more 50 or 20 billion facilities, and crucially, really, really crucially, the support from the banks. If the banks are saying no, then this is really going to be difficult to happen. And since we are talking about pricing, we are also seeing a lot of changes, specifically in Asia. I mean, we all agree North America and Europe are pricing natural gas at hubs, but as far as LNG in Asia is concerned, this is still based on GCC or oil index contracts. But over the past few years, specifically when gas prices or LNG prices were so high, there has been a pushback from the traditional sellers, and this is gone again with JERA, which has been indicating that, I mean, they want to have a different kind of indexation. And also the government are on the same line. In May 2016, the government of Japan published its LNG strategy, which is basically promoting the creation of an LNG trading hub in Japan. A transition, everybody is saying that this is going to take a decade or so, but please remember the story in Europe. Actually, the move to spot prices in Europe was much faster than people anticipated because there has been a discontinuity between contract prices and spot prices. So what could actually replace GCC pricing mechanisms? A lot of different possibilities. Obviously, we have US LNG, which is going to be based on Henry Hub. We could also have some kind of netback from Europe using NBP. There are a lot of Asian spot indices, including JKM, that everybody is looking at in the morning, but nobody really trusts. Average LNG prices in Japan and Korea, the two main LNG buyers. We could end up actually with some kind of hybrid prices, including all kind of different indexation. But what is still missing is a real Asian trading hub, which would reflect supply and demand balances in Asia. And this takes a lot of time to create because you have a lot of different steps which need to be fulfilled in order for this to happen. The first of which is actually creating a functioning third-party access to LNG and pipeline infrastructure, which actually is missing right now in most Asian countries besides Singapore. So a lot of different stages to be fulfilled. There have been 3 leading countries in Asia in terms of hub creation. We have Singapore, China, and Tokyo. All of them have created different exchanges. We have Sling in Singapore, we have the Petroleum Exchange in Shanghai, and we have also the Joy LNG Forward in Japan. All of them are really at the very, very beginning in terms of trading. So, I mean, there is, of course, potential for these exchanges to develop, but right now we are at the very, very beginning of the process. It has been interesting to see how Japan came up with an LNG strategy in May this year. Not only are they, of course, proposing that they should have an LNG trading hub, hopefully by 2020, supported by third-party access to LNG and pipeline, which, by the way, is still to be done. But, I mean, they also want to support the creation of such an independent pricing index through their own companies, for example, JBIC, which is traditionally supporting investments in infrastructure. But, I mean, this is what the government is saying, which is important, by the way. But in order for a trading hub to happen, you need not only for the government or the regulatory authorities to put the right framework in place, but you also need for market players to be playing along. And this is really what is key in Japan. So in conclusion, for this pricing part, we have a lot of different developments in Asia. They have been already going on for a couple of years since actually the IEA published its report developing a trading hub in Asia, in which I participated. The transition is going probably to be quite messy with ups and downs. We do see these three countries being in the lead, but it can actually result in different outcomes. I mean, Singapore representing more the Southeast Asian market, China based on not only an LNG hub, but also the pipeline supplies, and Tokyo having actually a trading hub which will represent the different pricing indexes. We can actually have different spot prices in Asia. This is a very big market, and remember that in Europe we also have different trading hubs. So in order to conclude, why do we say, or why did we have this name reconfiguration in the title? Because we think that the LNG world as we know it today will be fundamentally different in 5 years from now by 2020. And not only in terms of supply and demand, but also, as David highlighted, in terms of market players and in terms of how the market actually works. There is a lot of pressure from the buyers to change the current statu quo, to change how LNG is bought. They want more flexibility. They want different pricing mechanism, because at the end of the day, I mean, the future of the natural gas industry lies partly with the development of LNG. So if LNG is not competitive enough, then actually it's a big threat for the future of natural gas. And in that respect, the long-term contracts that have been until now really the key backbone of the LNG industry, I mean, they are really threatened by the development of spot and short-term LNG, because this can actually amount to about 43% by 2020. So in conclusion, buyers, but more importantly, sellers will have to adapt to the new market environment. I mean, they will have to change how they operate and really pay attention to the cost, because there are a lot of new markets out there, as highlighted by David. I mean, you have markets in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. Altogether, they represent a very significant share of demand, but wholesale gas prices in these countries are still very low. So you really need the LNG to be competitive. And that can also happen through changes in pricing formation, even though there is a lot of resistance from the current sellers. As a conclusion, we can say that, well, I mean, there have been some changes in terms of contracts, and the sanctity of long-term contracts is no longer guaranteed. As we have seen with the contract between Petronet and RasGas, it has been changed. So if we have a disparity between term prices and the spot prices, there might be a lot of pushback from our traditional LNG buyers saying, you know what, by the way, I think we can no longer continue as we have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well done. Thank you. One thing we haven't mentioned, sorry, while you're setting up, there's an excellent technical appendix in the book, which actually, in simple language, explains the technical side of the LNG chain. So I think it's a really good overview, something to give some of the newer people coming into LNG and say, have a read of that and you'll understand it. So I think that's another part of the book that I'm particularly proud of. So it's excellent. I wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Is this on? Great. So what can I say? That was next time, I think you need to put more information on each slide and try to convey more in 40 minutes. I mean, obviously, there's a reason this book is 600 pages. There's an enormous amount of 700.
700.
Including the technical
you
appendix.
need to take
I didn't read the data appendix.
You didn't read the data, Jason? Oh, come on.
But so there's a lot that I think I want to ask you, and there's a lot we want to talk about. And joined by Howard Rogers and Jonathan Stern, too, to talk about this. So let me pose a couple of questions. So just, and I will say as a reminder for those watching online and those listening also to the podcast, that we're joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau and David Ledesma, Jonathan Stern, and Howard Rogers from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, discussing a fantastic and comprehensive new book, LNG Markets in Transition. And I will also remind people, again, watching online, that you're able to ask questions, too, through Twitter using the hashtag CGEP events, sending it to our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy, which you've been following. You've watched their presentation and also seen me live tweeting it. So there's a lot of, we have people in the room. We also have people online, I think, with varying degrees of expertise in the LNG market. A lot of what you presented was pretty detailed in terms of what it would mean for contract structures around the world. Can we just step back for a minute and kind of let me ask you, I started in my introduction by talking about the way the LNG market was in transition and why this could be really consequential for geopolitical relationships, for economies around the world, for the transition to a low-carbon economy. Is that true? And if so, can you kind of draw a connection between some of the details you just put up and what it means for these broader things that we spend a lot of time thinking about here at the School of International Public Affairs, for example?
I think...
Or Jonathan or Howard.
Should I go first, Howard, then hand
Yeah.
over to you? I think that this also comes down to the role of gas. The role of gas, and as I presented in my part of the presentation on demand, which was based on a lot of work that Howard had done, there is this whole issue as to what is the role of gas going to be, particularly in the large markets of Asia, the battle of coal, renewables versus gas and LNG. Certainly, the issue from the LNG side, it was mentioned by Anne-Sophie on the supply, is the ability to underpin new liquefaction capacity. And my concern is that we live in a world of surplus, certainly over the next 3-4 years. And there'll be a bit of complacency coming in simply because of the changes taking place. And I love the slide you presented, which basically says, how the hell can a buyer actually make a commitment today? And I think that is a real challenge, where on one side they're having the pressure from their governments on COP21, and on the other hand they've got liberalisation in their markets. There's just too many variables for them to be able to make that commitment. And my concern is we aren't going to see any FIDs on that. Howard, do you want to kind of make a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this varies by region. In North America, gas has won out over coal primarily because of the generation economics in the power sector. In Europe, I'll maybe leave Jonathan to say a few words about how gas is faring. In Asia, as David said, I think there's a kind of the hangover effect from the high LNG prices, primarily driven by oil and a tight spot market in the period 2011 to 2014. When I looked at government policies in writing the subchapter in the book on Asia, there is no overt role for gas in the energy policy. It's a kind of a reluctant residual. And there seems to be a belief in many countries that if you promise to build a lot of renewables, that means you can still burn a lot of coal and somehow magically meet your COP21 INDCs. And I guess people can believe that for a few years because the monitoring operation isn't actually going to be in until the end of this decade. But I think it's a false premise. I think that in the next few years, low LNG spot prices are the best thing going to establish gas more in some of these markets, and some countries have left it too late with maturing domestic production, and they will install FSRUs at the 11th hour. So I think it's a mixed picture in Asia, but and huge uncertainty, but I see growth for LNG demand. Jonathan, do you want to say something about Europe briefly?
Gas has suffered hugely in Europe over the last decade, really, partly because of the high prices during 2011 to 14, partly because of low coal prices, and partly because of policy support for renewables. And the gas industry hasn't really got to grips with this. There is some hope and a demonstration in the UK that if you have a decent carbon support price, you will get switching from coal to gas. But we haven't seen that elsewhere in Europe because we haven't got, the EU ETS has not produced a strong enough price signal, and we don't have any other national carbon support price that is high enough. But let me just, since you mentioned COP21, let me just say I'm doing a piece of work at the moment on really what gas needs to do in the wake of decarbonisation and decarbonisation policy. And for me, the fascinating thing is, you know, many of us here live in Europe, which is obsessed by carbon and COP21. The further I go away from Europe, the less I find this obsession. When I go to places like Asia, nobody talks to me about climate change. Nobody talks to me about COP. I have to ask. That doesn't mean they're not interested in the environment. It means their priorities are different. Their priorities are air quality rather than carbon reduction. But one of the things that is terribly interesting for me is that other parts of the world are investing in renewables, not, I think, because they are principally concerned about climate change, but because renewables offer them the best hope of low-cost energy. And what we have to be interested in the fossil fuel community, particularly the gas community, is can gas compete with that kind of policy mindset? And it certainly can't compete at the kind of prices that we saw between 2011 and 2014. We have to be thinking of gas prices way below $10 a million BTU to get into some of the markets that David and Anne-Sophie were talking about. And this is something very new for the gas community, and it's something which talks about cost reduction as really a big priority, and of a type that maybe the industry hasn't yet got to grips with.
So if you, let me just ask, if Anne-Sophie, you said, you had a slide showing, I think nearly half, 43% of gas would be sold on a spot basis or short-term basis by 2020. So let's bring what you just said, Jonathan, back to changes in the LNG market. What are these changes, what are these shifts in the way gas is, what is the LNG market changes we're going to see through 2020 and the changes in pricing? What does that mean for the role we think gas might play or not in meeting low carbon policy, also given the other changes that are going on, dramatic declines in the cost of renewables, which makes it in some ways harder for gas to compete. Is it a complement or a substitute?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I mean, natural gas, as we have all said, is facing two major issues, which is, first of all, the price level and how competitive it is against alternatives, and also the lack of support of politicians. I mean, in general, natural gas is taking the third place behind energy efficiency and renewables. And also, quite often, it's taking the fourth position behind coal. Because if you are asking a lot of people in Southeast Asia right now, they are going to tell you, COP21? Yeah, well, we didn't really discuss COP21. I mean, what really matters right now is access to electricity. Coal is good. Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Philippines, coal. Natural gas, oh yeah, that fuel which was so expensive over 2011, 2014. Well, yeah, we will have a little bit of natural gas, but we shall see. And I mean, as Howard mentioned, there are a lot of countries now which are starting to think, oh, wow, actually LNG is very cheap, so let's have an FSRU. Yes, but post-2020, if we don't have LNG supply, then prices are going to go through the roof again. Countries with FSRUs are going to say, oh, wow, that's way too expensive. We can't afford that because, I mean, you know, we are developing countries. So, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, the consumers has to pay. So, well, really sorry, Golar, Accelerate, but can you please take your LNG, your FSRU, because we don't need it anymore. Gas is too expensive. So really, I mean, from a sustainable point of view of the natural gas position in the primary energy mix, we need to avoid a huge boom and bust cycle. We need to smooth the post-2020. So we still need to have LNG coming in post-2020. And I have to say, this LNG has to be affordable, because otherwise it's going to have dramatic implications for the role of natural gas, especially given the growth of renewable and the fact that, it's becoming more and more affordable. Forget the times where wind and solar were so expensive. Now, they are becoming okay, depending on the gas price you are looking at.
I think it's also worth noting that, with the uncertainties which we made in our presentation, in the transition towards the boom and bust market you're talking about, I think we're in for a more volatile price world. And when we look at policymakers, that's actually not what policymakers want. Whatever the price level is, they actually want to have relative stability of price. And I think that certainly volatility is going to be the name of the game.
Lower prices on average, but higher volatility.
Yeah, well, whatever the level is. I'm not going to
right.
say, Jason, whether it's lower or higher, but I'm just saying I think there will be volatility.
And so we can I've talked more about sort of the role in Paris. I want to touch on some other issues. I would just note that you also put up a slide, David, that I thought was important, which was noted the questions about controlling methane and other things and thinking about the life cycle greenhouse gas impact of LNG, which is an important thing for industry and for policymakers, I think, to focus on. Can I ask what the point you just made about smoothing the potential underinvestment cycle? That's sort of the conventional narrative. We have a glut now through 2020, the US and Australia coming online, but no one's investing, so then the market, 2022, 3, 4, whatever it is suddenly short gas. Is that kind of how you see the most likely scenario right now, and what do you think could change that outlook?
I think, unfortunately, it looks like the most likely scenario because there are very few companies which are ready to take FID. There are a few exceptions. Eni's project with the backing of Exxon in Mozambique is one of them, maybe also the expansion of Papua New Guinea. But, there are a few people who are, raising their hands and saying, I am going to take FID, that's for sure. I'm just finishing everything, the contracts, etc. Because, we are still in this conventional mindset that we need to have kind of demand certainty and also having some kind of pricing framework which is kind of certain, because buyers right now, they want everything. They want also different pricing formulas. They are inventing everything between Hanoi indexation, NBP indexation, maybe forward-looking. Let's have, if it's created in 10 years, some kind of Asian trading hub. So, they are becoming very, very creative. So, what we are going to see, quite likely, is a lot more portfolio LNG. This is already happening. If you open the very excellent GIGNL or G2GNL annual report, and you look at the long-term contracts, whether it's long-term or short-term below 4 years, you can see it's portfolio, a lot of portfolio. This is an interesting approach, but it has one big risk, which is everybody looking at exactly the same market, which is exactly what happened over the years 2011, 2014. People were all looking exactly the same market analysis, thinking, okay, so Japan, Korea, China, big market. And everybody was looking at the same kind of unmet demand in China and not anticipating, of course, the slowdown and also all the other things which have been happening.
And how much the question of whether we're setting ourselves up for an underinvestment cycle, it's hard for people to invest when you have this huge supply coming online. You also obviously talked about changes in the pricing structure, the increased volatility, the spot market. How much of a challenge is it going to be to finance these projects, even if you wanted to build one, given how this market is changing?
I think I want to be an optimist. And I want to, let's be clear about it. Cost is king.
Yeah.
It's very important, something you said very clearly in your presentation. And I think that buyers and sellers, neither buyers and sellers want to have volatility. And I think buyers and sellers, there is a case where they will work together. And I think, we've mentioned JIRA in the presentation as looking at things in new ways. And I think JIRA and other companies like that will look and say and realize that we need to have new capacity in the future. We're going to have to work out how we're going to make it work. And buyers will need to, together with sellers, sit down and make it work. There has to be a new way of thinking. And this is very clearly the message that was being given out at the LNG 18 conference in Perth. We need to think in a different way to be able to get the costs down. Now, on the financing side, I think the message certainly from the financing community is if the project makes economic sense, then the money will be available. I think it's going to have to be on shorter-term contracts, and that is going to have an impact on the level of leverage or level of gearing that's going to be available. And potentially then the investors are going to be able to do that, and the equity holders on that. But I think I'm not going to say financing is not an issue. I'm just going to say I think it's a problem that can be surmountable.
And we are also likely to see more and more smaller projects.
Yeah.
I mean, forget about the huge 15 MTPA project where you have to find at least 80% of the buyers. I mean, I think we are going to see more and more
Small scale.
1, 2, 3 MTPA. I mean, exactly any size, you know. I mean, it's easier because the capital costs overall are smaller, and the likelihood that you can actually find 2 or 3 buyers to support this quantity is higher.
It matches the market, doesn't it? Yeah.
And
let's
this is what the market
talk
wants.
about, we're in the U.S. Let's talk about what the U.S. might do to the global gas market. I mean, you talked about the flexibility, the indexation to the Henry Hub spot price, but in this price environment, hard to see a lot of new FIDs being taken, but there's several projects. I mean, it adds up to a lot when you look at just what's in the works. And then when you think about what that gas supply in the global market, the analysis often looks at whether it competes on a marginal cost basis because of the sunk cost nature of the tolling fee. And you tee up the question in your book about whether in the face of these, you know, contracts that when there are more economic sources of gas, are people going to kind of stick with these tolling fee contracts, or are they going to force renegotiations and walk away from them? Can you say what you learned about that question? Because it matters a lot for U.S. LNG into the global market.
Are you looking at me, or are you going to answer that?
Okay, I'm starting.
You go first, okay.
First of all, I mean, we have not really seen US LNG on the market yet. I mean, we have only the first train of Cheniere. So, I mean, the real thing is going to start 2017, and then we will see a lot of US LNG 2018, 2019, 2020. So this is where the fun is going to happen, if we can talk about fun. I mean, the market conditions are fundamentally different from what people were expecting before. People were expecting that actually US LNG would be very competitive. It would be so attractive because it would beat oil index gas, notably in Asia. Well, this is no longer the case, and now people have to think with the fact that, well, we have to consider that the $3 per MMBTU of liquefaction fee is sunk cost. We have to be able at least to cover our variable costs. This could be okay for a lot of the AAA companies, the AAA off-takers which have signed up for US LNG, but there are a couple of companies which are not in this kind of conditions. And the real question is, after a couple of years or maybe more of very low spot prices, having to pay the liquefaction fee, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, a few $100 million, are they going to say, sorry, that's enough? There is no renegotiation clause in the contract, but you know what? I can't do it anymore. So can we sit on the table and change the contract? And if this happens with only one company, this is like the house of cards.
The pack of cards collapses. Yeah. And the developers of the capacity, of course, are not large AAA companies, and they're not going to be able to necessarily underpin the difference. And the bankers are going to come running to them. It is very challenging, let's put it like that. And you know, people look to the regas and they say, well, hang on, the regas capacity sat empty for years and years and years. But the liquefaction fees are going to have to be paid, you know, 10 times what the regas ones were. So this is big money.
Jonathan, Anne-Sophie put up a slide raising the question. I wasn't sure there was a definite answer, but raising the question about whether a price war was coming in the European market with Russian gas. You know European market and Russian gas very well. How would you answer the question?
My answer to the question is the Russians do not want a price war. But if there is a price war, they have the capacity to win it, and they will win it, because their ability to go down in terms of cost is very substantial. There's a very interesting joke circulating around Europe about Russian sanctions, which is, what would you do if you really wanted to hurt Russia? Answer, remove the sanctions. Because if you remove the sanctions, the ruble-dollar exchange rate will appreciate enormously, and that will make it very difficult for the Russians to reduce their costs. So I mean, there are many more things than gas costs involved here. Now, the ruble-dollar exchange rate and the ruble-euro exchange rate are really crucial. But the other thing which is very important is US LNG has a kind of geopolitical symbolism for Russia, as it does for other people, which is everybody wants to talk about US LNG clashing with Russian gas in Europe. Well, it hasn't happened yet, and so if you mentioned that as soon as the big volumes of US LNG come on, it probably will happen. This is a battle that the Russians are determined to win and are equipped to win. As I say, they don't want it, and I don't think my answer to Anne-Sophie's question, will they provoke it? No, I don't think they'll provoke it. But if it happens because of market conditions, they will do their best to win it, and I think they are in a pretty good shape to do so.
Yeah.
And so related to that, they write in their conclusion, one effective way of limiting Russian gas supplies would be to delay any capacity additions for Russian pipeline gas. Your expectations for Nord Stream 2?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about Nord Stream 2 is that the European Commission has the ability to stop this through administrative measures, at least delay it for a period of time. If I had to guess, I would say that it will not happen before 2020, but it will happen in the early 2020s, and it will happen partly because it's very difficult legally to stop it. It's possible to stop it administratively by going through the courts. The Commission might do that, but my guess is that there will be a deal done before 2020, and that deal will involve some kind of guarantee that a certain volume of Russian gas will continue to transit through Ukraine in exchange for Nord Stream 2 being allowed to go ahead. And this should work as the way we, and particularly Howard's model, does the sums on how much Russian gas Europe will need. So Europe will continue to need quite a lot of Russian gas, and so say 30 billion cubic meters, that's 3 billion cubic feet a day in American language, continuing to go through the Ukraine, should be enough of a trade-off to allow Nord Stream 2 to get built.
And we could walk through the whole map and sort of talk about all the sources of supply. You covered a lot of them there. One that is maybe not, I don't know if you think it's large in volume, but timely in other ways. I'm just curious what you think about the potential for Iran LNG coming into the market. Is that something you expect to see or not?
I mean, there are two options for Iranian LNG. Either it's coming through Oman, which, I mean, do remember that Oman has been really struggling to export and meet its domestic demand at the same time, and is already importing natural gas by pipeline from Qatar. So that's the first solution. Or building its own LNG liquefaction capacity. But I mean, this is really probably 10 years down the road.
So let's open it up to questions with the time we have remaining. There's a microphone here. If you could briefly introduce yourself and ask a question. We have a question in the front row from Adrian, and then one over here and one over there.
Thank you. Jonathan has told us that the Russians will not pay for U.S. exports going to Europe, essentially. Who is going to pay for those exports over the, to 2020, 2022? How will the tolling model fare over that time frame? How will the stress on that model develop over time? Could you be a bit more precise? Because, I mean, you sound very optimistic about everything, but to get to the long term, we have to go through this period up to 2020, 2022. What is going to happen? Who is going to pay for U.S. exports?
Okay, well, I think, shall I go first? And then
Yeah,
I think one of the factors which is causing disquiet at the moment is the low oil price. And so if we were to find recovery in the oil price, which I'm actually quite hopeful about, because I think we can't necessarily continue at the current levels, then once that starts broadening out, then if we get to $60, $70 on the oil price, then US LNG is not uneconomic. And in fact, you could recover your full costs on that. So I think I don't see I see the pain period maybe over the next 4 or 5 years. I think after that it will recover. Howard, do you comment?
Yeah, okay. So I think it's a slightly different story depending whether you're in the low demand world or the high demand world, primarily thinking about Asia. So in the low demand world, US LNG could have quite a painful period when there's a glut of LNG that ends up going to Europe, that the Russians decide, they're going to defend their market share at around about 15 BCF a day, which is what they've been exporting to Europe. So the market clears by a little bit more gas to coal in Europe, but not much. A little bit more induced spot LNG demand in Asia, but probably not much. And the last clearing mechanism is the spread between Henry Hub and European hubs squeezing down so that some US LNG is not exported by those off-takers whose variable costs, are more than the spread difference. So that's how it clears. In the high case, that might only happen for a couple of years, so that's not too much of a problem. But here we're only talking about covering your variable costs. So for these LNG export projects, what they really need is European hub prices at around about $8-9 an MMBTU. They're currently about 4 or 5. So we're talking then about a world where prices have recovered. Historically, European hub prices have their set by the ceiling represented by Russian oil products index contracts by arbitrage. So there's a little bit of story there about oil prices taking up those Russian contract prices, and a story about Russia regaining market power in terms of pricing in Europe again once the glut has cleared. So this is a bit of a complicated roadmap, but a very real one in terms of the moving parts. So in a high demand world, there's a period of a few years before you get to reasonable European prices and the US projects are okay. In the low demand world, it could be painful in terms of full cost recovery until the early 2020s.
So you were a co-author on the Great Chapter in here on demand, which is a book within a book, about 130 pages. So tell us a little bit about what you expect. I mean, I sort of asked the question when I welcomed everyone: have we missed the golden age of gas? Technology, policy, a whole bunch of different shifts. What's your outlook?
Okay, so one reason why there is so much uncertainty is the key Asian markets that will drive the timing of when we need new FIDs are either subject to great uncertainty or not very transparent. So Japan nuclear restart pace and extends. So they've started up 5, they've shut one down again for operational reasons, another one shut down because of legal opposition from the local population. That doesn't give you much of a guidance as to how the next 2 or 3 years are going to go. So there's a huge uncertainty on Japan LNG demand. China, again this morning we hear Professor Rogoff with stories about a Chinese hard landing. That doesn't give you much faith in gas demand growth. And this is a country that doesn't publish its energy consumption statistics in a very transparent or timely manner. So it'll be 2 or 3 years before we know which scenario China is on. India is even more mysterious. There's a very complex allocation of supply and subsidization model. There's an administered price. So that is going to be very difficult to pin down. Other markets in Asia, the energy policy is uncertain. I think the renewables coal thing will get resolved in terms of a dilemma eventually. And the small markets later on, as they need LNG to supplement their declining domestic demand, in aggregate is quite a big sum, but it's later in the 2020s. So in a nutshell, that's Asia.
There was a question over here. The young woman had a question here, and then over here, and then over here. No, sorry, but just start over there. Yeah, thanks.
Hello.
Maybe we'll take like 2 or 3 at a time and then give them a chance to answer.
Hi, my name is Eva Paul. I'm a graduate student in the conflict resolution program with a focus on the extractive industries. You've mentioned that there has to be an adjustment made with gas pricing and decoupling from oil prices, especially in Europe. We know that Gazprom's policy regarding their pricing of gas does not directly only depend on what the Russian government just wants, but also on their kind of bloated structure and their high costs. So my question is, do you think what their capacity is to adapt, and would they be able to adapt?
Let's take another one here. We'll do 2 or 3 at a time so that we can answer. Right, you had a gentleman, you had a question, yes?
Brad Leach, I'm an energy consultant. The question relates to the Asian market. Singapore, China, and Japan have all been mentioned as influential market locations that might be capable of generating hub activity and regional pricing. But the populations in those locations differ considerably. To what extent do you think the population and the potential for gas demand represented by the population will be influential in those locations taking on significance as gas pricing locations?
Let's just pass it over there for one more question, and then we'll...
My name is Robert Silla, and I was wondering if you could comment on the role of some of the larger gas trading companies, Total, Shell, and Exxon, because it's not really an open or a free market, and they control a big portion of the total production.
So Russia's ability to adapt, the Asian market, and the gas trading companies.
Shall I start? I mentioned earlier that the Russians are in a colossally strong position. You really need not to discount this constant refrain that they have high costs. Yes, they do if they're going to develop new supply, but they have between 10 and 15 billion cubic feet a day of shut-in gas that they could produce now if they had the markets. They do not have high costs. They have, as it were, high sunk costs, that they invested a lot of money that they shouldn't have done because things looked different 5 to 10 years ago about how much gas they would need. So they are in very good shape. Europe is well on the way to completing a transition to hub-based pricing, not in the south and east, but the northwest it's complete. Central Europe it's in pretty good shape. So we have a very well advanced transition to hub-based pricing in Europe, and the Russians are in pretty good shape. They have adapted a lot. They need to adapt further, but they are in a great position depending on how they wish to play their commercial hand.
Asia, who wants to take that?
I will take it. I mean, I think the main question about Asia is really, first of all, putting the regulatory framework in place, which is going to allow for a trading hub to exist. I mean, in Europe and in the United States, there were some necessary preconditions which made it possible for trading hubs to develop, including third-party access, which would be really necessary. It does already exist in Singapore, but it does not exist in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. So that's one of the key issues. Also, I mean, governments have a nice habit to actually interfere in energy markets, so that's also something to take into account. And you also need to have a wholesale gas price liberalization, so no more interference there. So, I mean, these are really the very first stages that are necessary in order to have the development of trading hubs. But there is what the government can do, and also you need to have market participants playing along, as I explained. I think there is a good possibility that this will start to develop more rapidly in Singapore, because you already have a lot of market players. This is, I mean, you have the Shell, the Exxon, the Total, the LNG, everybody is there. I mean, you can actually go to a party of LNG people there, they gather every 2 or 3 months and they talk about LNG. This is quite funny. I mean,
It's not funny, it's great.
yes, okay. Well, I found the white absolutely. But yes, I mean, it does exist, and the government is really supportive of that. So you need to have actually these two conditions, both the government being supportive, and this is what is a bit lacking right now in China. I mean, for 2 years ago, I had great hope for China, and they seem to have been sleeping for 2 years. Now it's coming back again, but if you talk to Shanghai Energy Exchange, I mean, they are quite disappointed. And you really need to basically change the mentality of the three main players, because they don't want to give access to their infrastructure, both LNG and pipeline.
David, on
Okay.
trading, and if
On the
you
trading,
keep your
and
answer
then
brief, we'll get another question or two in before we wrap up.
Okay, on particular players, I think the role of the traders, the aggregators, which you and Sophie mentioned will have an enhanced role, has been to bridge a variable and changing and flexible demand, which we've been introducing in the book as increasingly becoming flexible, with the stability that's required to develop new LNG resources. They've taken on that aggregator role. And the other thing they bring, of course, are the balance sheet to underpin all of this. But I think each of the companies are very different. I think that Shell and Shell BG now, of course, is far more trading its mentality, moving towards gas versus oil and balancing that portfolio. And I think they are probably going to be more of the kind of dynamic trader. ExxonMobil has played absolutely the opposite end, preferring not to do that. But they've had to take a role on, particularly as they've got spare capacity in the build-up of the Papua New Guinea projects. And in the middle, you've almost got Total doing that. So I think the crux of the question is it depends on the company, but they are going to have to enter greater trading to link these two parts of the chain to make it work and bring their balance sheet for that.
So there's one final question in the back, because you had your hand up earlier, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, it's Ian Nathan. I lead the gas and LNG practice and the research and advisory group at Energy Intelligence. First of all, thanks everyone. This is very interesting and appreciate you being here. My question is on the new markets, on the new markets angle. We've talked about a lot of uncertainty with regard to demand, but with regard to these prospective markets, can you think of those that are, whether they be in Asia or Africa or wherever they might be, and think of those with the greatest potential for LNG imports, but then at the same time, those that perhaps have the highest obstacles, regulatory, institutional, and other sorts of things that can potentially obstruct those imports. So basically, where's the biggest disconnect in these prospective markets? And that's open for everyone. Anyone
who wants to
throw out some countries?
probably have time for one person to answer it. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in the book, you'll see them. I mean, basically, you're looking at countries which have developed natural gas, usually their own domestic production, and it's grown to be a significant part of their energy mix. And like all governments, the UK government in the early 2000s, the US government in the early 2000s prior to shale, things start looking bad, your production starts to decline. As a government, the last thing you do is face up to that until it's almost too late. So you've seen Pakistan, bring in an FSRU and thinking about the second one. The next country like that is Bangladesh. You can imagine Vietnam getting into that. Singapore will become more LNG focused as its pipeline supplies die out. Thailand is also in that position. So, that's a very common analog to look for. Outside of Asia, Egypt is exactly in that position, although the Zohr field is a bit of a white knight to the rescue and will probably reverse things around. But, we've seen this before, so it's something to look out for, because the last people to face up to this are the governments themselves until it's almost too late. And FSRUs create a fantastic opportunity to provide the energy at much shorter notice than was possible before in the form of LNG.
I think it's just the flexibility of the game, isn't it? That's the thing that comes out in the book. New players, new models. And even in Australia, for example, FSRUs are being considered as a means of accessing the southeastern states because there isn't enough pipeline capacity to get the gas down. So it's a really flexible commodity now.
So that may be the answer to my final question, which was to say, like, I mean, I can't read this. This is too big. So I need.
You mean you haven't read it?
So I
Your
need.
son has read it. I've seen the
That's
picture.
true. That's true. I need it in a tweet. So in 140 characters or less, summarize this book, each of you.
Change a market that's changing, that companies have to realize that they will have to change their models.
What would you say?
People will have to adapt, so expect unexpected situation of global LNG market in 5 years from now, completely different from what we have now.
Okay. So we have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change, and I think the implications are hugely consequential. So I really appreciate the time and work you put into the book. I appreciate the time and effort to travel from the UK, from Riyadh, to visit with us in New York and release it and explain it to us. I hope you'll come back again, and please join me in thanking the authors and our panelists.
Thank you, Jason, for hosting us. Thank you very much.